The soft sound of Andre's fingers gliding over the piano keys filled the air. Each note seemed to resonate more deeply in the isolated house, an old and storied structure surrounded by a dense forest. Here, where light rarely penetrated, Andre had lived for almost 2 years, since the accident that left him blind and took his wife's life forced him to retreat from everything and everyone. He chose this isolation not only to avoid the pitying looks of others, but to seek some peace in the silence. Music was his only companion. He played daily, as if the notes could push away the weight of the absence he felt so strongly. Blindness had heightened his other senses, and now sound was his main connection to the world. But lately, something began to disturb him. Despite the house's quiet and his appreciation for it, subtle, small noises started to intrude upon his tranquility. It was hard to identify immediately: an unusual draft, the faint rustling of something in the distance, or perhaps a window rattling. He told himself it was the natural sound of an old, remote house, but an uncomfortable sensation prevented him from simply ignoring it. After playing the last chord, Andre stood up and slowly walked to the window. It didn't make a difference to look outside. Darkness was already a part of his life. He felt the cold breeze entering through a crack, the same window he always closed, but seemed to open on its own. Could it be a sign? A small detail, but enough to create a growing sense of unease. He sighed, closing the window again, as he did every night. He tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. But the weight of the silence that once comforted him now felt denser. He returned to the piano, seeking refuge in the music. But for the first time in a long while, the sound of the keys did not dispel the unrest. That night was quieter than usual. Andre felt the heavy silence around him, as if the very air was still. He lay down on the living room sofa after finishing his piano playing, trying to relax. However, as soon as he closed his eyes, a different sound broke the monotony. Footsteps. Small and quick, but unmistakable. Something or someone was moving through the house. Andre's heart raced. He remained still, concentrating fully on his keen hearing. The footsteps seemed to be coming from upstairs. He briefly thought he might be imagining things, that the excessive silence was playing tricks on him. But soon he heard it again, this time closer. The sounds were faint, as if someone was trying to avoid being heard. His mind sought a logical explanation. Perhaps it was an animal that had entered through the window, a small rodent. Yes, that must be it. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Who could be there, in his isolated house, in the middle of the night? Andre took a deep breath, fighting against the growing fear. He walked slowly to the stairs, trying not to make any noise, feeling the banister with his fingertips. He knew every detail of the house, and the visual memory he retained from before his blindness helped him navigate. When he reached the top of the stairs, he paused to listen again. The sound had stopped. For a moment, everything returned to silence. Only the rapid beating of his heart echoed in his ears. He wondered if he had really heard something, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. However, as he took another step, his foot bumped into something out of place. It was a chair. He knew exactly where he had left that chair the night before. And it was not where it should be. A shock coursed through his body. Someone had been moving things in his house, and he had no idea who or why. Andre's mind raced with terrible possibilities. He hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. His first reaction was to look for the phone, but something inside him held him back. It was as if the house was somehow alive, conspiring to confuse him and keep him trapped in this growing terror. He returned to the living room, his sweaty hands sliding along the walls, and sat at the piano once more. He tried to play a piece of music, something that always calmed him, but this time his hands trembled, and the notes sounded wrong. The discomfort grew, and the feeling of not being alone overwhelmed him. Something was definitely wrong, and he knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The early morning hours were dragging on, and the silence Andre had always known in his house now felt oppressive. He tried to calm his mind, but unease had taken over his body. Sitting at the piano, he concentrated, listening for any sound that might reveal what was happening. Again, footsteps echoed down the corridor. This time they were firmer, closer. Each step seemed like a jolt to his nerves. Andre sprang to his feet, driven by the instinct to protect himself. He listened intently, but the sound stopped as soon as he moved. It was as if the presence, whatever or whoever it was playing with him, challenging his sanity. The darkness that had always been a part of his life now felt denser, impenetrable. He clenched his fists and tried to keep control, knowing he needed to think rationally, but everything seemed to be slipping away from him. He headed for the phone, ready to call the only friend who visited occasionally. He tried to dial, but the phone was silent. No sign of life. Desperate, he fumbled with the cables, checking if they were connected, but everything seemed normal. How was this possible? He felt a wave of panic surge through his chest. He was alone, and worse, he didn't know who or what he was dealing with. Andre returned to the corridor, using the wall as a guide, moving slowly toward the direction of the footsteps he had heard moments before. As he approached the upper corridor where the sounds had started, a loud crack broke the silence. The guest room door creaked open. The sound was sharp, as if announcing its presence, a reminder that he was no longer in control of his own space. He stopped abruptly, his ears alert. He felt something very close now, a physical presence. His breathing grew heavy. Suddenly, he felt a draft brush his face, as if someone or something was by his side. Instinctively, he recoiled. But there was nothing to see, just the silence and the emptiness of the darkness he knew so well. Disoriented, Andre returned to the living room, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. What was happening? Who was doing this? Why him? He tried to remember anything that might explain what was happening, any clue from his recent interactions. Nothing made sense. The house, always so quiet and familiar, now felt like a trap. He began to feel like he might be losing touch with reality. But then, he heard something that chilled him to the bone. A whisper, low and indistinct, but close. A voice, speaking softly. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound was clear enough to know he wasn't imagining it. Andre felt the fear intensify. He was being watched, perhaps even hunted. Something or someone had chosen him as a target. Desperate, he tried to focus on the sounds again, but everything fell silent. The only thing he could do was wait, agonized, for another sign that he wasn't alone in the house. Andre's desperation grew with each passing minute. His home, once a refuge of peace and silence, was turning into a dark prison. Every sound seemed amplified by his imagination, as if the very rooms were conspiring against him. He knew he needed to leave, to escape the oppressive feeling before he lost complete control of his mind. Without wasting any more time, Andre decided to act. He hurried down the stairs, his bare feet thudding on the wooden floor, echoing throughout the house. He threw open the front door with force, the cold draft hitting his face, but not enough to dispel the rising terror in his chest. He took a few steps outside, treading on the uneven ground around the house, trying to recall the path he should follow. But as he moved further, he realized how vulnerable he was. The darkness outside was no less threatening than the one inside his house. Without sight, the vastness of the surrounding environment became an invisible maze. He didn't know where to go. Any wrong step could take him further from the safety he strangely still believed existed within his own home. It was then that he heard the sound of rustling leaves. Something was moving around him. It was a subtle movement, but enough to make his body freeze. Who or what was watching him? Andre took a deep breath, trying to control his fear, but the sensation of being followed intensified. His hands trembled as he realized that, without sight, he was completely at the mercy of whatever surrounded him. Feeling trapped by the darkness outside, he decided to return to the house. As he closed the door behind him, he heard a familiar sound that made his body shiver. A soft, low voice, one he knew well, whispered his name, Andre. His heart stopped for a moment. That was his wife's voice. He stood still in the entry hall. His mind struggled to accept what he had just heard. It couldn't be real. Maybe he was delirious, exhausted from so many sleepless nights. But the voice continued, soft, almost hypnotic, like the days when she comforted him after long hours of practice. Andre, come. The voice seemed to come from upstairs, from the corridor where he had heard the footsteps earlier. His head spun with doubt. Was he being manipulated by his own mind, tormented by grief, or was something more sinister at play? His wife was dead. He knew that. And yet, that voice, It was impossible to ignore. It sounded so real, so close. Against all his instincts, he began to ascend the stairs again, guided by the sound. Each step was heavy, a mix of fear and distorted hope. When he reached the top, the house seemed even more oppressive, but he pressed on. The voice called to him insistently. "I'm here, Andre. Come." The confusion between reality and what his mind was creating made each moment more unbearable. He didn't know if he was being manipulated by something supernatural or if his own grief and isolation had finally driven him to the brink of madness. The persistent call of the voice guided him down the corridor as if it were an invisible trail. Andre followed, despite the fear that gripped every fiber of his body. The darkness was thick, but his wife's voice, or what he believed to be her voice, cut through the silence with chilling clarity. He arrived at the guest room door, the same one he had heard creaking open earlier, and paused for a moment, hesitant. "I'm here." The voice now came from inside the room. Andre didn't want to enter, but something compelled him to move forward. He pushed the door slowly, the creak echoing through the house like a final warning. The air inside seemed heavier, almost suffocating. Even without sight, he could sense that the place was charged with something dark. He took a few cautious steps into the room, and then everything stopped. The silence became unbearable. The voice fell silent, leaving a void that heightened his senses. It was then that he heard another sound, different from the familiar voice. It was the breath of someone else, very close. "Who's there?" he shouted, finally breaking the silence. The sound of quick movement in the room made him recoil. In an instant, he realized he was not alone. The presence was not merely a creation of his disturbed mind. A shadow moved around him, and suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder. "I've been watching you, Andre," a male voice whispered. Andre felt his blood run cold. The heavy breathing of someone was within the range of his keen hearing. He tried to pull back, but the hand gripped his shoulder tightly, holding him in place. The unseen man was too close, and terror paralyzed him. "Who are you? What do you want?" Andre stammered, unable to hide the fear in his voice. "You've forgotten me, but I haven't forgotten you." The voice was cold, with a bitter edge. "I knew your wife, before you. She was meant to be mine, and you took her from me." Andre felt a mix of shock and confusion. He tried to piece together his thoughts, but the intruder's words were a direct blow to his already wounded soul. He tried to remember, but nothing made sense. Who was this man? What did he want? "I loved her, Andre," the voice continued, now filled with rancor. "She was never supposed to be with you. You both ruined my life, and now I'm here to ruin yours." The revelation hit Andre like an avalanche of pain. The intruder was not just invading his home, but also his memories and feelings. The connection with his wife, so deeply buried in his grief, was now surfacing, but twisted and tainted by the hatred of this man. Andre's panic turned into a feeling of total loss of control. He was defenseless against the vengeful presence, and the darkness around him made the situation even more desperate. He needed to fight. But how could he confront an enemy who knew his life so intimately? An enemy who used his blindness against him? The intruder took a step closer. Andre heard every movement, every breath. He was cornered, forced to confront a threat he didn't know how to overcome. The air around Andre felt dense, his mind a storm of panic and confusion. Every sound, every small movement around him seemed amplified by the darkness that surrounded him. He could feel the invader's heavy breathing, hear each careful step the man took. Although he was blind, Andre knew there was no more room to retreat. He had to act, somehow. "You destroyed my life, Andre," the man whispered again, full of hatred. "And now you will pay." The terror Andre felt began to transform into something else, a determination born from pure survival instinct. He had something the invader didn't, an intimate knowledge of the house, a familiarity with every small detail of that place. Even without sight, he knew exactly where each piece of furniture was, every object. Andre moved slowly, trying to control the growing fear. His fingers found the edge of a nearby table, a firm support amid the chaos. His mind began to calculate quickly. He knew that to face the man, he would need to use his sharp hearing and memory of the space to his advantage. "You don't know what you're doing," Andre said, trying to buy time, his voice steady despite the fear. "She's gone. There's nothing left to avenge." But the man ignored his words, and Andre heard quick steps approaching. In one swift move, he ducked, dodging the imminent attack. The invader stumbled over a chair, and the sound was loud enough for Andre to know exactly where he was. In an agile motion, Andre grabbed a heavy lamp beside him and without hesitation, struck in the direction of the sound. The lamp hit the man hard, and a cry of pain echoed through the room as the invader staggered backward. The thud of his fall filled Andre with a strange mix of relief and adrenaline. But the silence that followed was unbearable. The invader was still moving, groaning in pain, but clearly still a threat. Andre knew he didn't have much time. He got to his feet, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every breath, every little movement was vital now. The man tried to get up, but Andre heard him before he could react. He lunged at the invader, fighting against his own weakness but with an unyielding determination to survive. The two of them fell to the ground, and Andre used all his strength to pin the man down. "Enough," Andre shouted, holding the invader firmly. "It's over." The invader groaned in pain, his breathing heavy and uneven. Andre's arms trembled from the effort, but he managed to keep the man on the ground. He was exhausted, but determined not to let him escape. Finally, the man stopped struggling. His labored breathing slowed, and silence filled the house once again. Andre remained still holding the invader down until he was sure the danger had passed. When he finally stood up, exhaustion hit him with full force. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The physical threat had been contained, but the emotional pain remained. The weight of grief, now compounded by the revelations of that night, would not fade anytime soon. Andre, still panting, sat on the living room floor. The house, once a refuge of peace, was now marked by the memories of an unforgettable night. Though he had survived, he knew the real confrontation was yet to come. The confrontation with his past, with unresolved grief, and with the secrets he had tried to bury along with his wife. But for now, he was too exhausted to think about anything other than the feeling that, at least for the moment, the nightmare was over.